What if I told you that the ruins described in the second verse of Genesis are not the remnants of a raw, untamed world, but the wreckage of a sophisticated, fallen civilization? What if the canonical Bible only hints at its existence, while the forbidden texts, the scrolls that were deliberately removed from our scriptures, preserve its entire, shocking history? For years, brave pastors and theologians have spoken of a world before Adam, using the clues scattered throughout the Bible to piece together a picture of a pre-Adamic age, but they have only ever scratched the surface. They speak of ancient kings and cities, but lack the official records. Those records exist. They are waiting in the pages that the ancient councils ignored and the seminaries deemed too dangerous to teach. They tell the story not just of a lost world, but of a lost civilization, complete with a ruling class, advanced technologies, and a rebellion so profound it required a planetary reset. This journey will move beyond the gap theory. We will not merely speculate. We will present the evidence from the forbidden texts. We will reconstruct the map of the civilization before Adam, identify its rulers, detail its crimes, and reveal the ultimate reason why its history was erased from the Book of Genesis. Most people will settle for the simple story of creation, but you are here because you sense the echoes of something far older and far more complex. So prepare yourself, because once you learn of the civilization that was judged before Adam was ever formed, you will understand the true scale of the cosmic war we were born into. Before we unearth this forbidden history, be sure you are subscribed, with notifications enabled. What we are about to reveal is not just a missing chapter. It is the key to understanding the very pattern of rebellion and redemption that defines our world today. Exhibit A: the scar in Genesis. Before we open the forbidden scrolls, we must first establish the crime scene. The primary evidence is not buried in the desert sands, but is hidden in plain sight, in the very first lines of the Bible. After the majestic declaration of Genesis chapter 1, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," the narrative immediately pivots to a scene of utter desolation. Verse 2 states that the earth became formless and void, tohu va-bohu. As we have established in our previous investigations, this Hebrew phrase is not the language of pristine, raw material. It is the language of judgment. It describes the aftermath of a divine sentence carried out, a ruin, a wasteland. But the clues do not stop there. Centuries later, the prophet Jeremiah was given a vision that seems to pull back the veil on this primordial catastrophe. In chapter 4, he writes, "I looked on the earth, and behold, it was formless and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light." And he is using the exact same phrase, tohu va-bohu. But then he adds a chilling, often overlooked detail. "I looked on the mountains, and behold, they were quaking, and all the hills moved to and fro. I looked, and behold, there was no man, and all the birds of the air had fled. I looked, and behold, the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins before the Lord, before his fierce anger." Let the weight of those words settle. Jeremiah is not describing a pre-human planet. He is describing a post-apocalyptic one, a world that had fruitful land before it became a desert, a world that had cities before they were laid in ruins. He is witnessing a memory of a divine judgment so complete that it reset the planet. The prophet Isaiah reinforces this in chapter 45, declaring that God did not create the earth a place of chaos tohu, but formed it to be inhabited. The scripture itself testifies that the chaos of Genesis 1:2 was not God's starting point. It was the result of a judgment that ended a previous age. The canonical Bible presents us with the evidence of a crime, a ruined planet, and the memory of ruined cities. It establishes the what, but to understand the who and the why, we must turn to the testimony that was silenced. Exhibit B, the whispers of kings. The evidence for a pre-Adamic civilization is not limited to desolate landscapes. The scripture itself contains haunting whispers of a structured political world that predates humanity. The prophet Ezekiel, in chapter 28, delivers a lamentation against the king of Tyre. While this prophecy has a clear historical application, it quickly transcends the earthly king and begins to describe a being of far greater antiquity and glory, a figure universally understood to be Lucifer or Satan. But pay close attention to the specific political language used. The text says of this being, "By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. I cast you to the ground. I laid you before kings, that they might gaze at you." These verses are a treasure trove of investigative clues. First, it speaks of the abundance of your trading. Trading implies commerce, sophisticated exchange, and a network of interacting entities. It suggests a complex society, not a solitary existence. Who was this celestial prince trading with? What goods or knowledge were being exchanged? Second, and even more stunningly, it says, "I laid you before kings." Plural. This was not a world with a single ruler. This was a world with multiple kings, a political landscape with different realms and authorities. Who were these pre-Adamic kings? What were their kingdoms? The canonical text raises these explosive questions and then falls silent, offering no further explanation. It presents us with the tantalizing evidence of a complex, political and commercial civilization that existed before Adam, ruled by multiple kings, and then moves on, leaving the mystery hanging in the air. This is not an accidental omission. This is a deliberate redaction, to find the names of these kings and the nature of their civilization. We cannot stay within the safe walls of the canon. We must have the courage to open the scrolls that the gatekeepers chose to seal. Opening the forbidden scroll, the Book of Enoch. To move beyond the cryptic hints of the canonical Bible and into the detailed history of this lost civilization, we must now open the first of our forbidden scrolls, the Book of Enoch. For centuries, this text was lost to the Western world, preserved only in the ancient Ge'ez language within the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Its rediscovery among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 20th century was a thunderclap in the world of biblical scholarship, proving its immense antiquity and its importance to the Jewish community in the time of Jesus. This is not a medieval fantasy. It is an authentic voice from the world of the apostles. A text that the author of the New Testament epistle of Jude quoted as inspired prophecy. And what Enoch reveals is staggering. It does not speak of a vague world before Adam. It describes, with the precision of an intelligence report, a highly organized global administration governed by a specific class of angelic beings known as the Watchers. This is the first key to unlocking the mystery. The kings and nations hinted at in Ezekiel and Jeremiah were not human. They were the celestial governors of a pre-Adamic earth. The Book of Enoch presents these Watchers not as the demonic entities we might imagine, but as a divinely appointed order. They were holy beings, dispatched from the high heavens with a sacred mission to watch over, guide, and administer the early earth. They were, in essence, the divinely sanctioned government of a primordial world. The text even provides their command structure. It names their chief, Semjaza, and lists the other primary leaders who served under him, each with their own rank and area of authority. This was not a chaotic assembly, it was a celestial hierarchy, a civilization of angelic beings with a clear mandate from the throne of God. And it is their story, their initial commission, their catastrophic rebellion, and their ultimate judgment that constitutes the forbidden history that was erased from Genesis. The rulers, the council of the Watchers. The civilization before Adam was not a loose collection of angelic beings. It was a structured hierarchy, a cosmic government with a clear chain of command. The Book of Enoch, acting as our declassified intelligence file, lays out this structure with astonishing detail. At the apex of this earthly administration was a council of high-ranking angelic princes. While their numbers were vast, the text identifies a specific ruling body, a council of 200 leaders who were responsible for the direct governance of the planet. Presiding over this council was their chief, a figure of immense power and authority named Semjaza. Under him, the book names a cohort of other archons, or rulers, each presiding over a smaller contingent of 10 angels. Figures like Azazel, Barakijal, and Kokabiel were not just names, they were department heads in this celestial administration, each responsible for a specific aspect of the created order. This was the government of the primordial world, a network of angelic kings ruling over their designated territories and spheres of influence. Their original mandate, as far as the text reveals, was benevolent. They were the Watchers, a title that implies guardianship, observation, and stewardship. Their purpose was to ensure that the divine order established in the first creation was maintained. They were the viceroys of God on earth, the priest-kings of a world that did not yet know human sin. The cities Jeremiah saw in ruins were likely their seats of power, centers of administration from which they governed their territories. The trading Ezekiel mentions was the commerce of a sophisticated angelic society, exchanging knowledge, resources, and perhaps even worship. This was not a world of primitive chaos. It was a world of profound, celestial order. It was a civilization governed by beings who had walked in the light of God's throne, who understood the laws of physics and the music of the spheres. They were the perfect rulers for a perfect world. But it is in the perfection of this order that the seeds of the greatest possible tragedy were sown. For what happens when the guardians of the kingdom decide they no longer want to serve the king, but to become kings in their own right. The crime-forbidden technology transfer. The fall of this pre-Adamic civilization was not a slow decay into moral ambiguity. It was a singular, cataclysmic event, a deliberate act of high treason. The crime, as detailed in the Book of Enoch, was not merely lust, as is often assumed from the Genesis account. The lust for human women was a symptom of a deeper, more calculated rebellion. The core of their crime was the illicit transfer of forbidden knowledge, a deliberate act of cosmic industrial espionage. The narrative pivots on the moment when the Watchers, led by Semjaza, gathered on the summit of Mount Hermon and bound themselves by a mutual oath. They swore to descend and not only take human wives, but to teach humanity the secrets of heaven. This was not a gift of enlightenment, it was an act of sabotage. Each of the ruling Watchers, according to their specific area of expertise, began to download classified celestial technology into the unprepared minds of early humanity. The list of these forbidden transfers, recorded in Enoch, is terrifyingly specific. Azazel, a high-ranking leader, taught the art of metallurgy, the forging of swords, knives, and shields, effectively introducing warfare into the human experience. He also taught the making of cosmetics and jewelry, the arts of seduction and vanity. Other Watchers revealed the secrets of sorcery, of astrology, of root cuttings for magical purposes, of the interpretation of signs. This was not a gentle education. This was the weaponization of a primitive race. The Watchers handed humanity the tools of gods, knowing they possessed the hearts of children. They were not trying to elevate humanity, they were trying to corrupt it, to create a hybrid civilization that was bound not to God in humble worship, but to them in fearful dependency. The civilization they built was not a reflection of heaven's order, but a counterfeit, a Babel of mixed technologies and spiritual rebellion, a kingdom designed to challenge the authority of the Most High. This was the true nature of their crime, not just a fall from grace, but a deliberate attempt to create a rival kingdom on earth, powered by stolen divine technology. The consequence: the birth of the Nephilim. The final, monstrous product of this forbidden union of celestial knowledge and terrestrial flesh was the race known as the Nephilim. To call them giants is a profound understatement that fails to capture the horror of their existence. They were not simply large men, they were a biological and spiritual abomination, a hybrid race that had no natural place in the created order. They were the ultimate consequence of the Watcher's pride, a living testament to the crime of mixing the holy with the profane, possessing the supernatural strength and intellect of their angelic fathers, but cursed with the ravenous, untamed appetites of a corrupted humanity. The Nephilim became the tyrants of the pre-Adamic world. The Book of Enoch describes their reign of terror in grim detail. Their hunger was insatiable. They consumed all the produce of the earth, and when that was not enough, they began to devour animals. And finally, they turned on humanity itself, consuming human flesh and drinking human blood. Their existence was a cancer on the face of the planet. They introduced violence, cannibalism, and a level of systemic oppression that the world had never known. The violence that Genesis 6 states filled the earth was not the random squabbling of primitive tribes. It was the organized, predatory terror enacted by these demigod offspring. They were the final, corrupt fruit of a civilization that had been built on stolen knowledge and forbidden desire. Their very being was a declaration of war against the Creator. God had made man in his own image, but the Watchers had co-opted that image, twisting it into a monstrous parody of their own rebellious nature. The Nephilim were the ultimate expression of this defiance, and it was their existence, this incurable genetic and spiritual contamination, that made the judgment of a planetary reset not just a punishment, but a terrible necessity. The civilization of the Watchers did not just fall into sin, it gave birth to a race that was the living embodiment of it. 2 floods. The catastrophic scale of the Nephilim's corruption forces us to re-examine the nature of God's judgment with greater precision. The common assumption is that there was one great flood, the one Noah survived. But this creates a chronological problem. The ruin described in Genesis chapter 2, the tohu va-bohu, is a global planet-altering devastation that seems to precede the 6 days of restoration in which Adam is created. The great flood of Noah, however, happens many generations after Adam. How can both be true? The forbidden texts, when read carefully alongside the canonical scriptures, suggest a staggering possibility there were 2 distinct global floods, 2 separate acts of divine judgment for 2 different rebellions. This is a critical distinction, a piece of the hidden history that unlocks the entire timeline. The first flood was the Luciferian flood, the direct result of the war in heaven and the subsequent judgment upon the Watchers' civilization. This was the cataclysm that shattered the original creation, the event that literally knocked the planet off its axis and reduced the world to the dark, waterlogged chaos of Genesis 1-2. Its purpose was not to cleanse, but to obliterate, to completely erase the failed angelic civilization and reformat the planet for a new beginning. The second flood, the great flood of Noah, was a different event with a different purpose. It was not a planetary reset, but a targeted genetic cleansing. By Noah's time, the world had been repopulated. But the Nephilim contagion, the cursed bloodline of the Watchers, had resurfaced and was spreading, threatening to corrupt the Adamic line completely. The flood of Noah was a divine surgical strike, a precise and terrible act of mercy to preserve the purity of the human genome and save the covenant bloodline from extinction. By distinguishing between these 2 events, the entire biblical narrative snaps into focus. God had to intervene twice. First, he had to destroy the rebellious angelic kingdom that ruled the primordial earth. Then, centuries later, he had to cleanse the earth again to remove the lingering spiritual and genetic residue of that first rebellion. The Bible does not describe one flood, it describes a war of 2 great judgments. Opening the second scroll, the Book of Jubilees. If the Book of Enoch provides the declassified military intelligence on the Watcher civilization and its fall, then our second forbidden scroll, the Book of Jubilees, provides the legal and chronological framework for the world that was rebuilt from its ashes. While Enoch focuses on the cosmic why of the first judgment, Jubilees focuses on the divine how of the restoration. It presents itself as a direct dictation from the angel of the presence to Moses, a heavenly chronicle detailing the re-establishment of divine order on a cleansed planet. The first and most critical act of this new order, as revealed in Jubilees, was the restoration of time itself. The chaos of the tohu va-bohu was not just physical, it was chronological. The rhythms of the original creation had been shattered. So, the very first thing God re-establishes is his calendar. Jubilees declares that the true eternal calendar of heaven is a perfect solar year of 364 days. This is not a human estimation, it is a divine institution. It is the clock by which the angels operate and the rhythm by which all of creation was meant to function. The re-establishment of this heavenly calendar was a profound declaration. It was God reimposing his perfect, unchanging order upon a world that had been thrown into chaos by rebellion. The 6 days of creation described in Genesis 1:3 and onward are, in this light, not just days of making, but days of reordering, of recalibrating the planet back to the frequency of heaven. This act of restoring time is the foundational principle of the new world. It is the basis of the covenant that will be established with humanity. To walk in God's time is to walk in his order. To deviate from it, Jubilees warns, is to step back into the chaos of the fallen age. The 6 days of creation, therefore, were not just the beginning of a new world, they were the beginning of a new covenant with time itself, a promise that as long as humanity honored God's appointed rhythm, the chaos of the former age would be held at bay. Adam, the new steward. Within this meticulously restored and recalibrated world, Adam was not created as the first biological life form, but as the first divinely commissioned administrator of the new order. He was not born into an empty, pristine void. He was placed into a reclaimed territory, a planet that was, in effect, a post-war reconstruction zone. His role was not to start from scratch, but to steward a fragile new beginning on a world that held the scars of an ancient failed civilization. The Garden of Eden, therefore, was not a global paradise. It was a localized headquarters, a divine embassy, a protected, consecrated space from which God's new order was meant to expand. It was a beachhead of heaven on a planet that had once been enemy-occupied territory. Adam's commission was not that of a simple gardener, it was that of a viceroy, a priest-king tasked with extending the boundaries of this sacred space until the whole earth was brought back under the benevolent dominion of its rightful king. His mission was to guard this new beginning against the spiritual residue of the former age. The serpent who appears in the garden is not a random intruder. He is a survivor of the old fallen order, a representative of the rebellious civilization that had been judged and cast down. Adam's first and most critical test was to enforce the new jurisdiction, to expel the remnant of the old rebellion from the sacred precinct. His failure to do so was not a simple act of disobedience. It was an abdication of his primary duty as the steward of God's new world. He failed to guard the border, and in doing so, allowed the chaos of the former age to infiltrate the new one. Why was this history erased? This brings us to the central, unsettling question of our investigation. If this detailed, dramatic, and theologically profound history of a pre-Adamic civilization, its fall, and the subsequent restoration is so critical to understanding the entire biblical narrative. Why was it so thoroughly erased from the canonical scriptures? Why would the gatekeepers of tradition choose to present us with a simplified, almost sanitized version of events, leaving the full, terrifying story to be discovered in the forbidden scrolls? The motives were likely complex, born not of a single conspiracy, but of a long, slow process of theological curation driven by a desire for order and control. First, the full story is profoundly disturbing and complicated. The narrative of a divinely appointed angelic government rebelling, creating a monstrous hybrid race, and forcing God to reset the planet is not a simple, comforting bedtime story. For the scribes and councils tasked with creating a foundational text for a fledgling nation, a simpler narrative, one that placed the origin of sin squarely on human shoulders, was far easier to teach, codify, and control. Second, the story of the Watchers dangerously blurs the lines between the divine and the demonic, and between angels and humanity. In a world surrounded by pagan nations that worshipped a pantheon of demigods, heroes, and divine beings, the story of the Watchers could have been easily misinterpreted, potentially leading to the very kind of angel worship that the Torah strictly forbids. It was perhaps deemed safer to silence the story of the fallen guardians than to risk the people worshipping them. Finally, and perhaps most critically, the history of the Watcher civilization reveals a catastrophic failure within the heavenly hierarchy itself. It suggests a vulnerability in the divine order that could be profoundly unsettling to the faithful. A story that begins with human failure in a perfect garden is a story about the need for human repentance. A story that begins with an angelic failure in a perfect world is a story about a cosmic war that is far larger and more terrifying than we can comprehend. The gatekeepers of Scripture, for reasons of theological stability and pastoral safety, may have made a deliberate choice to present humanity with a story they could manage, rather than the full, untamed truth of the cosmos. The legacy of the lost civilization. Though its history was erased from the official record, the legacy of the Watcher civilization was never truly extinguished. Its shadow lingers, casting long, faint echoes that can still be detected in the oldest and most mysterious remnants of our world. The forbidden knowledge they transferred to humanity did not simply vanish in the cataclysm. It became a kind of cultural virus, a corrupted data stream that has persisted in the mythology, architecture, and secret traditions of mankind. Consider the megalithic structures that dot our planet, defying both history and physics. Sites like Baalbek in Lebanon, with its impossibly large foundation stones, or the precise astronomical alignments of ancient temples that seem to predate any known civilization with the capacity to build them. Are these merely the works of forgotten human genius, or could they be the faint, eroding fingerprints of a technology that did not originate on Earth? A remnant of the building knowledge imparted by the Watcher civilization. Consider the world's mythologies. From the Greek Titans, the rebellious demigod children of Uranus heaven and Gaia earth, to the Sumerian Apkallu, wise beings who came from the sea to teach humanity the arts of civilization. Nearly every ancient culture preserves a fractured memory of a time when divine beings walked the earth, intermingled with mortals, and imparted superhuman knowledge. These are not disparate fantasies. They are the fragmented echoes of a single historical trauma, a shared memory of the pre-Adamic world, distorted through the lens of 1,000 different cultures. Even the esoteric and occult traditions that have survived in the shadows of mainstream religion, the arts of astrology, alchemy, and ritual magic often claim an antediluvian origin, a secret knowledge passed down from a lost golden age. Could these be the corrupted, weaponized remnants of the sacred sciences the Watchers taught? A divine technology severed from its divine purpose. The legacy of the lost civilization is not found in history books, but in the mysteries that history cannot explain. It is the ghost in the machine of human culture, a silent reminder that our world is built upon the ruins of another. The cosmic thread. The repeating pattern. The story of the pre-Adamic civilization is not an isolated, one-time event. Once we recognize its structure, a divinely established order, followed by a rebellion fueled by pride and forbidden knowledge, culminating in a catastrophic judgment, we begin to see this terrifying pattern repeating itself throughout the entire biblical narrative. The fall of the Watcher civilization was not the end of the war. It was the establishment of its rules of engagement. Consider the civilization of Noah's descendants, united by a single language and purpose on the plain of Shinar. They, too, possessed a form of advanced, perhaps residual, knowledge. They, too, were driven by a prideful ambition to make a name for themselves and to build a tower that would reach into the heavens, a direct echo of the Watcher's attempt to breach the divine boundary. And they, too, were met with a divine judgment that shattered their civilization and scattered them across the face of the earth. The story of Babel is the Watcher pattern repeating on a human scale. Consider the nation of Israel. They were given a perfect, divinely established order, the law of Moses, the tabernacle, the priesthood. They were set apart as a holy civilization. Yet, time and again, they rebelled. They sought forbidden knowledge in the form of idolatry from surrounding nations. They were driven by the pride of kings who broke the covenant. And they, too, were met with a catastrophic judgment, the destruction of their temple and their exile into Babylon. The fall of Jerusalem is the Watcher pattern, replayed within the context of the covenant people. This cosmic thread, this repeating cycle of order, rebellion, and judgment, is the engine of biblical history. It reveals that the fundamental conflict is not a simple struggle between good and evil, but a perpetual war against a specific kind of prideful rebellion that seeks to use divine knowledge to achieve autonomy from the divine. The civilization before Adam was simply the first, and perhaps most dramatic, iteration of this pattern. Its story was erased, but its legacy, its very behavioral DNA, was passed down, becoming the tragic inheritance of every civilization that followed. Beyond the sermon, this is why our approach to these ancient texts must be different. It is not enough to listen to a comforting sermon that smooths over the rough edges of these terrifying histories. To truly understand the world we live in and the cosmic war that underpins it, we must move beyond the sermon and into the realm of the investigation. A sermon, by its nature, aims to inspire, to comfort, and to provide moral guidance. An investigation aims to uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or complex it may be. The story of the pre-Adamic civilization is not a simple parable about obedience. It is an intelligence briefing. By studying the forbidden records of Enoch and Jubilees, we are not just satisfying our historical curiosity. We are gaining critical insight into the strategies, motives, and methods of an ancient, ongoing adversary. We are learning to recognize the repeating patterns of rebellion and judgment. We are equipping ourselves to discern the difference between divine order and its clever, prideful counterfeits. A sermon might tell you that Lucifer fell because of pride. An investigation of the ancient texts shows you how that pride manifested through commerce, through the establishment of rival kingdoms, and through a desire to be worshipped. A sermon might tell you that the flood was a judgment on sin. An investigation reveals the specific nature of that sin, a strategic, genetic corruption aimed at destroying the human lineage. To know this is not just to have more information, it is to have a more sophisticated understanding of the battlefield. We move from being passive believers, comforted by simple truths, to active watchmen, armed with a deeper knowledge of the conflict that rages around us, your sacred mirror living in the recreation. And so, we arrive at the final, personal implication of this forbidden history. You were not born into the first, failed creation. You are a citizen of the recreation. Like Adam, you have been placed into a world that has already been judged and cleansed not by the waters of a flood, but by the blood of the Messiah. You have been given a new beginning, a restored mandate, a fresh start on a planet that is contested territory. This is the sacred mirror the story holds up to your life. The same choice that faced the Watcher civilization, and later Adam, now faces you. Will you live as a citizen of the fallen order, drawn to its pride, its forbidden knowledge, and its desire for self-rule? Or will you live as a faithful steward of the recreation, submitting to the calendar, the laws, and the authority of the true king? The civilization before Adam built its kingdom on the foundation of stolen divine knowledge. Its citizens sought power, autonomy, and the right to define their own reality. We see the echo of that civilization all around us today in a world that worships technology, that celebrates pride as a virtue, and that constantly pushes the boundaries of what it means to be human, often without any regard for the Creator's design. To live in the recreation is to consciously reject that pattern. It is to choose the humble wisdom of the Scriptures over the arrogant allure of forbidden knowledge. It is to align your life not with the chaotic, man-made rhythms of the world, but with the steady, sacred time of the King. It is to recognize that you are not the ruler of your own life, but a steward in a kingdom that is being restored. The question is not whether you are aware of the ancient war, but which side you are actively building for. How has the discovery of this erased civilization changed the way you see your own role in God's great plan of recreation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us, together, learn what it means to be faithful citizens of the new world.